I had just gotten home from school. The day had been ordinary, long classes, the usual chatter with friends, and a bus ride back that felt like it would never end. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I figured mom or dad had left it open to let some air in. I pushed it gently, stepping inside, and that's when I heard their voices. At first, I didn't think much of it. My parents talked all the time, and sometimes they had arguments or discussions. But this time, something made me pause. The tone of their voices wasn't just serious. It was tense. I could hear my mother speaking, and I instinctively stopped in my tracks, hiding just behind the door, trying to make myself as small and silent as possible. I wish we never had Simon, I heard her say. Her voice was low, but I could feel the weight in every word. It was a mistake, and I regret it every day. My heart dropped. I stood frozen, my mind racing, but I couldn't move. I didn't want them to know I was there. My father responded, his voice softer, more measured, almost pleading. He was trying to calm her down, telling her it was in the past, urging her to move on, to think about the future. But my mom wasn't having it. She cut him off, still clearly upset, saying how she had felt trapped and unhappy ever since my birth. I felt like I was glued to the spot, unable to move. I didn't know what to think or feel. I just knew I had to get out of there before they caught me listening. Slowly, I backed away from the door, careful not to make a sound. I slipped out of the house as quietly as I could, feeling the cold air hit me as I stepped back outside. My mind was spinning, replaying her words over and over again. I wandered around our neighborhood for a while, aimlessly. I felt like my whole world had just shifted, like the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. I wanted to scream or cry or maybe both, but I just kept walking. The next few days were strange, to say the least. I tried to avoid my mom as much as possible. Every time I saw her, I couldn't help but hear her voice saying those words again in my head. I felt like an outsider in my own home. Meals were awkward. I would make excuses to leave the table early or pretend to be busy with schoolwork. I noticed things I hadn't before, the way my parents wouldn't look at each other, the tension in the air. It was like there was this invisible barrier between them, one that I had never noticed before. I kept thinking about what I had overheard, wondering if I should confront her or just pretend I never heard it. But every time I thought about asking her, I felt this knot in my stomach. What if she doubled down? What if she said something worse? I wasn't sure I was ready to hear any more. Eventually, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed to talk to someone, so I reached out to my closest friend, Mia. We met at our usual spot, a small coffee shop near school. I was nervous, my hands trembling slightly as I stirred my coffee. Mia could tell something was up the moment she saw me. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I took a deep breath and started to explain everything I had overheard. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could feel it shaking a bit. When I finished, Mia looked stunned. She didn't speak for a moment, just processing everything. Finally, she said, "You can't just keep this to yourself. You have to talk to her." I nodded slowly. "But what if it makes things worse? What if she really means it?" Mia reached out, squeezing my hand. "That's why you need to confront her, but do it carefully. You deserve to know the truth." Her words made sense, but they didn't make me feel any less afraid. I spent the rest of the day mulling over her advice, trying to decide what to do. I felt torn between wanting to know the truth and not wanting to hear anything that might hurt me even more. I tried to distract myself with schoolwork, music, anything to keep my mind off it, but nothing seemed to work. The tension in the house was still there, and I felt like I was walking on eggshells. My mom seemed distant, and my dad was unusually quiet, like he was thinking deeply about something. I caught him glancing at me a few times, but he would quickly look away when I noticed. Then, one evening, just as I was about to go to bed, I received a text from my dad. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk. Can you meet me in private tomorrow?" My heart pounded as I read the message. Why did he want to meet me alone? Did he know I had overheard them? Was he going to ask me to forget what I heard? Or was there something more to this? I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, my mind running through every possible scenario. I kept hearing my mother's voice, those words echoing in my head, and now I had my father's message to think about too. By the time morning came, I still didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. Update. The next day, I met my dad at a small cafe near our house, the kind of place he liked to go when he wanted to talk about something serious. He was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. As soon as I sat down, I noticed he seemed tense, his eyes darting around like he was looking for the right words but couldn't quite find them. He looked up at me, trying to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He asked if everything was okay, his voice a bit shaky, almost like he was afraid of what I might say. I shrugged and said I was fine, trying to act casual, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. He kept glancing at me like he was waiting for me to say something, fishing for some kind of hint. His questions felt pointed, like he was trying to get me to admit something without directly asking. I decided to play dumb, pretending I had no idea what he was getting at. I just nodded along, answering his questions as vaguely as possible, but I could feel the tension building between us, like a rubber band being stretched too tight. I could sense he was holding something back, but he wouldn't say it. After a few minutes of this uncomfortable back and forth, he finally sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking defeated. I realized he wasn't going to come out and say whatever it was on his mind, so I decided to leave it for now. When I got home, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. I couldn't just pretend I hadn't heard my mom say those things. The words kept echoing in my head, and I felt like I was suffocating in my own house. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them. So I decided to confront my mom directly. I found her in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. I walked in and stood by the counter, my heart pounding. She glanced up at me, sensing that something was off, and paused, her hands still in the soapy water. I took a deep breath and went for it. I told her I had overheard what she said to Dad the other day. At first, she looked surprised, her face tightening, but then her expression shifted to something defensive. She insisted I must have misunderstood, that I had heard wrong, but I stood my ground, repeating her exact words back to her. Her eyes flickered with something, maybe panic, maybe anger. She started to deny it again, but then stopped herself, like she knew there was no point in lying anymore. She finally admitted to saying it. She said she regretted having me, that it was true. My mom looked away, not meeting my eyes, like she couldn't bear to see my reaction. She told me she never wanted kids. She explained that she had me because her own parents pressured her into it. She had felt trapped, stuck in a life she never wanted, and that resentment had built up over the years. She spoke quickly, almost like she was trying to get the words out before she could think twice about them. She said she had struggled with depression for years, and my birth had been the tipping point. She hadn't known how to handle it, how to feel, and over time, that had turned into this bitterness. I could see a mix of guilt and something else in her eyes, like she was both sorry and angry, both at herself, and maybe even at me. I stood there, feeling my chest tighten. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to yell, to cry, to run away, but I just stood there, staring at her. She didn't apologize, not really. She didn't say she was sorry for feeling the way she did, only that she didn't know how else to feel. She seemed to want me to understand, to somehow make sense of why she felt the way she did, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to process everything she was telling me. I felt a strange mix of anger and empathy bubbling up inside me. I wanted to hate her for saying what she did, for feeling like I was a mistake, but at the same time, I could see the pain in her eyes, the years of frustration and unhappiness. It was like looking at a stranger and my mother at the same time. I knew I couldn't stay in that house, not right now. I told her I needed to get away for a bit, to clear my head. I needed space, time to think. As I turned to leave, I heard her voice break. She called out my name, and when I turned back, I saw tears streaming down her face. She looked desperate, like she was on the edge of some emotional cliff and didn't know what to do. But I couldn't deal with it, not right then. I just nodded and walked out, grabbing my keys and heading to my friend Mia's place. I stayed at Mia's house for a couple of days, trying to make sense of everything. I replayed that conversation with my mom over and over and over in my head, wondering if I had made the right choice in confronting her. It felt like I had opened a door that couldn't be closed again, and I didn't know if I was ready for everything that might come through it. Just as I was starting to think about heading back home, maybe trying to talk to my mom again, my phone buzzed with a new message. I picked it up, thinking it was my dad or maybe even my mom, but it wasn't. It was from an unknown number. The message was short, just a few words, but they made my blood run cold. I have information about your family that could change everything. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who could it be? What information did they have? And why did they reach out to me now, of all times? I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had thought confronting my mom would give me some closure, some answers, but now it seemed like things were only getting more complicated. Update. I stared at the message from the unknown number for what felt like hours. I have information about your family that could change everything. I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted from me, but something inside told me that I needed to find out. I took a deep breath, typed a quick reply, and waited. A minute passed, then another. Finally, my phone buzzed with a new message. They claimed to know my mother from years ago, said they were close to her at one point, and hinted at a hidden affair she'd had around the time I was born. My stomach twisted as I read the words. An affair? I wondered if this was the missing piece, the reason behind all the tension, the resentment, the regret I had overheard my mom talking about. But there was more. They mentioned that my father might not be my biological parent. That thought hit me like a truck. Everything I had known about my life, about my family, suddenly felt like it was on shaky ground. I replied, asking for more details. Who were they? Why were they reaching out now? The response came back quickly, saying they were a distant relative or someone close to my mother who knew her well during that time. They didn't give their name, but they promised they could give me proof if I wanted to know more. I decided I needed to dig deeper on my own first. I went home and started going through some old family documents. There were old photo albums, letters, things my parents had kept from when they were younger. I looked for anything that might point to some hidden part of my mother's past, some clue that would confirm or deny what this stranger was telling me. I found some pictures from around the time I was born, but nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I found a box I'd never seen before, tucked away in the back of a closet. Inside, there were letters, faded and yellowed with age. Most of them were from my grandparents, but there were a few from someone else, someone who wrote to my mother in a way that seemed different. The language was intimate, affectionate. My heart pounded as I read through them, feeling like I was invading her privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. The dates on the letters matched up to around the time I was conceived. I realized that if what the unknown person had told me was true, there was only one way to know for sure. I needed a DNA test. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also couldn't ignore the possibility. I started to consider how I could get samples from both of my parents without them knowing. But I wasn't the only one who seemed to be hiding something. My dad, who had always been so straightforward and honest with me, was now acting like he knew more than he was letting on. I noticed the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his voice would change whenever he talked about the past. It was like he was guarding a secret of his own. I finally decided to confront my mom again. I needed to know if there was any truth to what this stranger had told me. I found her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, not really watching it. I sat down across from her and asked directly about the affair. I told her everything, about the messages, about what I'd found in the letters, and how I needed to know the truth. At first, she tried to brush it off, acting like it was nothing, just someone trying to stir up trouble. But I pressed harder, mentioning the dates, the letters, and how they matched up with what the person had told me. Her face went pale, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. After a long silence, she finally admitted to the affair but insisted it had nothing to do with me or my father. Her voice cracked as she explained how she had felt pressured, trapped in her marriage and her life. She said she had felt isolated and had no one to turn to, and that's when the affair happened. She broke down, crying, saying she never wanted me to find out this way, that she had tried to forget about it, to bury it deep inside. But she kept insisting that the affair had nothing to do with me. I wasn't sure what to believe. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a void. Everything felt uncertain. I wondered if my life had been a lie, if the people I thought were my family were not who I believed them to be. My mom's words swirled around in my head, mixing with the messages from the unknown person, creating a storm of doubt and confusion. I decided to message the unknown person again. I needed more information, something concrete. I asked them how they knew my mother, how they knew about the affair, and what proof they had. The response came quickly. They told me they had been close to my mom back then, a friend who had seen everything unfold. They hinted that they had something that would clear everything up, but they wouldn't say what it was over the phone. They wanted to meet in person. My hands shook as I typed back, agreeing to meet. I felt like I was stepping into something I couldn't come back from, but I had to know. The unknown person agreed, saying they could meet in a public place and would bring everything they had that could change my perspective on my family forever. I put down my phone, my heart racing. I realized that whatever happened next, there was no going back. I would either find the answers I was looking for or open a door to more questions, more secrets, more lies. But either way, I was ready to face whatever was coming. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Update. I agreed to meet the person from the messages in a small cafe downtown, a place busy enough to feel safe but quiet enough for a private conversation. As I walked in, my eyes scanned the room, looking for someone who might be waiting for me. A woman sitting alone by the window caught my eye. She was in her mid-40s, with a calm expression but an alertness in her eyes. She noticed me too and gave a slight nod, as if she knew exactly who I was. I walked over and sat down across from her. She introduced herself as Lisa, a name I'd never heard my mom mention before. She didn't waste any time. She started by telling me how she knew my mother back then, explaining that they had been close friends for years. She spoke in a quiet, steady voice, as if she had rehearsed this conversation many times in her mind. Lisa explained that the affair my mother had wasn't just a brief fling or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was something much deeper, something that had almost led to my mother leaving my father altogether. She described how my mom had met the man, how they had fallen for each other quickly, and how they had started making plans to build a life together. It was more serious than I had ever imagined, and from the way Lisa spoke, it was clear that my mom had been on the verge of walking away from everything. I listened, trying to keep my face neutral, but my mind was racing. Then Lisa dropped the bombshell I had been dreading. She hinted that my mother's affair wasn't just about emotions or plans for the future. It was about me. She suggested that I might be the result of that affair, that my biological father might not be the man who had raised me. My heart pounded as she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She slid it across the table to me. Inside were letters, photographs, and old notes that painted a picture of a relationship far more intense than anything my mom had admitted to. The letters were filled with promises, confessions of love, and hints at a future that never came to be. The photographs showed my mom with a man I didn't recognize. They were smiling, looking happy in a way I'd never seen her before. I looked up at Lisa, feeling my chest tighten. She told me she had been there, had seen it all unfold, and knew how serious things had been. She explained that my mom had been torn between two worlds, and when she found out she was pregnant, she had chosen to stay with my father. But there was always a question, always a doubt about who my real father was. I sat there staring at the table, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me. Lisa's words echoed in my ears. I knew I needed proof. I thanked her for meeting me, took the envelope, and left the cafe in a daze. I had so many questions, but I wasn't sure I wanted the answers. Back at home, I knew I had to take the next step. I needed to know for sure. I decided to go through with the DNA test. Over the next few days, I carefully collected samples from my parents. It wasn't easy, but I managed to get a hair from my mom's brush and a toothbrush from my dad's bathroom drawer. I felt like a spy in my own home, sneaking around and avoiding questions, but I had to know the truth. I sent the samples off and tried to keep myself busy while I waited for the results. But the days dragged on, and I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. I decided to confront my dad to see if he knew anything more than he was letting on. I found him sitting in the living room, reading a book. I sat down and told him I needed to talk. I asked him directly if he had ever suspected that I wasn't his biological child. He looked at me, his face pale and his eyes full of sadness. He hesitated for a moment, and then he nodded. He admitted that he had always had doubts. He had known about the affair, had known there was a possibility that I wasn't his, but he had chosen to ignore it. He told me he loved me no matter what, that he had decided to stay and be my father because he couldn't bear the thought of losing me, regardless of the truth. Hearing that made everything feel even more complicated. I felt a mix of gratitude and betrayal, understanding and anger. I knew my dad loved me, but I also knew he had kept something huge from me my whole life. I left the room, needing space to think, needing to get away from everything for a while. The days felt like weeks as I waited for the DNA results. I couldn't focus on anything else. My relationship with both my parents grew strained. I avoided my mom as much as possible, and my conversations with my dad became short, awkward, filled with unspoken tension. I felt like I was living in a house full of strangers. Finally, the email notification came. The results were ready. I sat at my desk, my hands trembling as I clicked on the email. I felt a rush of anxiety as the page loaded, my breath coming in short gasps. I saw the first few words and stopped, my mind racing. The answer was right in front of me, but I hesitated, afraid to look, afraid to know. I decided to pause, to take a moment before reading further. I closed the email and stared at the screen, knowing that whatever those results said, my life was about to change forever. I'll share what I found out in the next update. Final update. I finally opened the email and read the results. The words were right there in black and white. My dad was not my biological father. I stared at the screen, the reality of it settling in like a heavy weight on my shoulders. For a moment, I just sat there, feeling the world around me blur, the room shrinking to the size of that one sentence. There it was, the truth I had been searching for, but somehow it didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. Instead, it felt like a punch to the gut, a blow that left me gasping for air. I put the phone down, feeling strangely relieved to finally have an answer, but also devastated by what it meant. My father, the man who had raised me, was not really my father. I knew I had to confront my mom one last time, to hear the truth directly from her, to understand why she had kept this from me, from both of us, for so long. I found her in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, moving slowly as if weighed down by her own thoughts. I walked up to her and told her I knew everything. I didn't have to say much more. She looked at my face and seemed to understand immediately. Her hands trembled as she put down the cloth and turned to face me. She started talking, her voice breaking as she explained how scared she had been, how guilty she had felt all these years. She said she never wanted me to find out like this, that she had been afraid of losing me, of breaking apart our family. She confessed that she had wanted to tell my dad the truth so many times, but fear had always stopped her. She was afraid of what would happen if he knew, afraid of what I would think of her if I ever found out. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, asking for forgiveness, saying she had done everything she could to protect me, to give me a normal life. But I couldn't give her what she wanted, not yet. I wasn't ready. I just listened, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside me. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't just forgive and forget right now. I needed to process everything. After our conversation, I went to find my dad. I knew I had to tell him the truth. He deserved to know, even if it was going to hurt him. I sat down with him in the living room, taking a deep breath before I started. I told him about the DNA results, about everything I had found out. He looked at me, his eyes wide with shock, and for a moment, I thought he might break. But instead, he reached out and took my hand, holding it tightly. He admitted he had always suspected, always had doubts, but he had chosen to ignore them because he loved me too much to care about biology. He told me I had always been his child, no matter what any test said, and that he wasn't going anywhere. He promised me he would always be there, that nothing would change how he felt about me. Hearing those words from him felt like a lifeline, a small piece of solid ground in the middle of a storm. I hugged him, feeling grateful for his love, but also knowing things couldn't go back to the way they were. Too much had changed. I knew I needed some time away from both of them to figure things out, to decide what I wanted to do next. I started to think about leaving, maybe moving to a new city, getting some space to clear my head. I needed time to understand who I was now, what my life meant in light of everything I had learned. I began looking at options for travel or a temporary move, places I could go to escape the confusion at home. Just as I was starting to make plans, I received another message from the unknown number. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. The message was short, just a few words, but they hinted at something more. There's still more you don't know. I think you should hear it. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of curiosity and frustration. I thought I had reached the end of this mystery, but now it seemed there was another layer, another secret waiting to be uncovered. I didn't know if I had the energy to keep digging, but a part of me needed to know what else could possibly be hidden. What more could there be that I hadn't already discovered? So here I am, standing at another crossroads, wondering if I should keep going or finally put this whole thing to rest. I don't know what I'll decide, but I'm sure of one thing. Whatever happens next, it's not the end of this story. There's still something out there, something I haven't found yet, and I'm not sure if I'm ready to leave it behind just yet. Maybe there's another update coming. Maybe there's more to this story than I ever imagined. I guess we'll see.